Somewhere, right now, there's a shovel hitting something it shouldn't, a farmer clearing a field, a diver chasing sponges along the seafloor, a shepherd chasing a lost goat up a hillside he's climbed 100 times before. None of them are looking for history, they're just doing their jobs. And then, without warning, the ground gives up something it's been holding on to for thousands of years. Okay, here's the thing about almost every discovery on this list. It doesn't start with an expedition. It doesn't start with a team of scientists in pressed khakis and a museum budget behind them. It starts with an accident, with someone noticing the one thing everyone before them had walked straight past, a body frozen in ice, so well preserved that the first people to find it thought it was a hiker who died the week before. Turns out he'd been dead for over 5,000 years. A ship buried whole beneath a grassy mound in the English countryside, sitting there quietly while the people who owned that field mowed the grass around it for generations. Think about that for a second. A Viking-age ship hiding under someone's lawn. A machine so advanced, pulled from a Roman shipwreck, that when scientists finally understood what it did, they had to accept the ancient world understood engineering they thought hadn't been invented for another 1,400 years. And a hill in the middle of nowhere that turned out to be older than agriculture itself, older than the wheel, older than writing, a place that made historians question the entire story of how civilization began. Here's the part I still can't get over. Every single one of these discoveries was almost missed, almost ignored, almost bulldozed, reburied, or thrown away. These are the 10 ancient discoveries that changed history forever. September 1991. Two German tourists are hiking through the Ötztal Alps, right along the border between Austria and Italy, over 10,000 feet up. They're not looking for anything except a good trail and a clear day. Then they see it, a body, half melted out of the ice, face down, arm twisted awkwardly beneath it. And honestly, if you were standing there, what would you think? Probably exactly what they thought. A climbing accident. Someone who got caught in a storm, maybe a few years back, maybe a few decades. Mountain rescue gets called. The body is chipped roughly out of the ice, the way you'd handle any recent death, without much ceremony. It's only when the remains reach a lab that everything stops making sense. This man wasn't a hiker from the 20th century. He was over 5,000 years old. And here's the part that still gets me. The ice hadn't just preserved his body, it had preserved almost everything around him. His clothing, his tools, even the contents of his stomach. Scientists could actually tell you what his last meal was. Ibex meat and grain, eaten just hours before he died. He had 61 tattoos across his skin, simple lines and crosses, made long before tattoo needles existed in any form we'd recognize. And this is the detail that surprised me most. Researchers now believe a lot of them were placed over joints that showed signs of wear, not decoration, pain relief, something startlingly close to acupuncture, thousands of years before acupuncture supposedly began in China. He was also carrying a copper axe. At the time he lived, copper was rare and valuable, which told researchers this wasn't just some anonymous traveler. He held real status. Okay, now here's where this stops being a 5,000-year-old mummy and turns into a 5,000-year-old crime scene. Buried in his shoulder was an arrowhead. He hadn't fallen. He'd been shot from behind, and based on the wound, he likely bled out within hours. There were defensive wounds on his hands, too, cuts that suggest a struggle before he died, and traces of blood from at least two other people on his weapons and clothing. Someone else got hurt as well, possibly by his own hand, in whatever happened up on that mountain. Nobody knows exactly why he was killed. A tribal conflict, a robbery, a betrayal by someone he trusted enough to let get close. That mystery is still open, and honestly, it'll probably stay that way forever. But here's why Ötzi actually matters. It's not the murder, it's what he gave historians access to. A complete, untouched snapshot of Copper Age life, right down to the bacteria in his gut and the pollen caught in his clothes. What people ate, how they dressed, what diseases they carried, how they died, all without a single written word. Every time I read about Ötzi, I stop thinking about archaeology for a second. I start thinking about the last few hours of an actual person's life. Someone running, bleeding, fighting for something we'll never fully understand. 5,000 years disappeared, and somehow his story still made it to us. He's one of my favorite discoveries on this whole list because he wasn't found. He was stumbled into. England, 1939. A wealthy landowner named Edith Pretty owns a stretch of farmland in Suffolk, and on that land sit a handful of grassy mounds that everyone in the area has simply learned to ignore. Cows graze around them, kids play on them. For generations, nobody thought twice. Pretty, though, has a feeling about them. She hires a local archaeologist named Basil Brown. No university degree, no formal credentials, just a sharp instinct and decades of hands on digging, and asks him to take a look. At first, it doesn't seem like a big deal. Brown starts with the smaller mounds, and most of them have already been looted, picked over by grave robbers centuries earlier. Disappointing, but not unusual. Then he moves to the largest mound. As he digs, he finds a rivet, just one at first, probably nothing, then another, and another, and another, laid out in a long, deliberate line. That's when it hits him. The wood of the ship had long since rotted away in the acidic soil, but the rivets had held their shape, tracing its outline like a ghost. He wasn't looking at a burial mound, he was looking at an entire ship, buried on dry land, with the vessel itself acting as a coffin, nearly 90 feet long. At the center of that ship was a burial chamber that somehow the looters had missed entirely. Inside was one of the richest hoards ever found in Britain, a stunning iron helmet with an elaborate face mask, gold and garnet jewelry worked with a precision that stunned goldsmiths who examined it decades later. Byzantine silver, weapons, coins that helped date the burial to the early 7th century. Now, here's why this discovery matters so much. Before Sutton Hoo, historians largely pictured early Anglo-Saxon England as a rough, culturally thin backwater, stumbling through what used to get dismissively called the Dark Ages after Rome's collapse. This single ship blew that idea apart. Whoever was buried there, likely a king, possibly Redwald of East Anglia, commanded wealth, trade connections stretching across the known world, and craftsmanship that rivaled anything happening on the continent. No body was ever found, by the way. The acidic soil dissolved it completely, leaving only a faint chemical shadow. But everything he was buried with told the story his skeleton couldn't. That's when historians realized they'd been looking at early England completely wrong. It gave a supposedly dark age a face, a level of sophistication, and a king's ransom in gold to prove it. What gets me about this one is that it sat there the whole time, not hidden in some remote desert, under a field somebody's family had owned for generations, mowed 100 times a year, right up until someone finally asked the right question about it. 1946 or 1947. The exact date is genuinely disputed. A Bedouin shepherd, often named in the story as Muhammad ed-Dib, is tending his flock near the cliffs by the Dead Sea when one of his goats wanders off, climbing toward a cave opening in the rock. Trying to coax the animal back down, he tosses a stone into the cave, more out of habit than intention. Instead of the sound of a startled goat, he hears something shatter. Curious, he climbs up and looks inside. Scattered across the cave floor are tall clay jars, and inside several of them, wrapped carefully, are ancient scrolls. At first, nobody quite grasps what's been found. The scrolls pass through several hands, sold in fragments, some for shockingly small amounts of money, before scholars finally start to understand what they're actually looking at. These weren't just old documents, they were some of the oldest known copies of the Hebrew Bible ever discovered, dating back as far as the 3rd century BCE. Alongside them were other texts, community rules, hymns, writings believed to belong to a Jewish sect called the Essenes, who may have hidden the scrolls in these caves to protect them, possibly from an approaching Roman army. Over the following years, more scrolls turned up scattered across 11 caves in the region, adding up to hundreds of manuscripts total. I want you to sit with why this stunned scholars so much. Before this discovery, the oldest complete Hebrew biblical texts anyone had access to dated to around the 10th century CE. This one find pushed that back over 1,000 years. And when researchers compared the ancient scrolls to the much later versions used for centuries, they found something remarkable. The core text had stayed almost entirely consistent across 1,000 years of hand copying. A few small variations here and there, sure, but that gave historians a rare, honest look at how these texts evolved and were passed down. This wasn't just a religious discovery. It was a window straight into the world of Judea 2,000 years ago, preserved by pure chance, protected by clay jars and dry desert air. And honestly, that's the part I keep coming back to. Someone, 2,000 years ago, cared enough about these words to hide them in a cave rather than let them disappear. And it worked. It just took 2,000 years and a wandering goat for anyone to notice. Everyone knows the eruption. Mount Vesuvius, 79 CE. Ash and pumice raining down on a Roman city until it vanished off the map entirely. But here's the thing. The eruption isn't actually the interesting part of this story. The interesting part is what happened almost 1,700 years later, when people realized the city hadn't just vanished, it had been preserved. For centuries, Pompeii existed only as a rumor buried under farmland, occasionally hinted at when workers digging wells or foundations struck ancient walls and shrugged it off. It wasn't until the 1700s that organized excavation began in earnest, and honestly, it was driven more by treasure hunting than curiosity at first. Statues and artifacts got pulled out and shipped off to decorate royal collections, with little regard for what any of it meant. Then, over time, something changed. Excavators started noticing strange hollow pockets in the hardened ash layers. When one of them had the idea to pour plaster into these voids and let it set, the results were haunting. The ash had solidified around the bodies of the dead, and as those bodies decomposed, they left behind perfect hollow molds. The plaster filled in exactly where a person had been standing, sitting, or crouching in their final moment. Suddenly, this wasn't just a city of broken columns and shattered pottery. It was a city frozen mid-sentence. And this is why Pompeii is so incredible. What made it so valuable to historians wasn't the grand villas or the temples. It was the ordinary stuff. Bread, carbonized but intact, still sitting in an oven exactly as it was left. Graffiti scrawled onto walls by regular citizens, jokes, political slogans, even declarations of love, and yes, complaints about the neighbors. Turns out people were annoyed by the person next door 2,000 years before apartment living was even a thing. For the first time, historians weren't guessing what everyday Romans were like. They could actually see it. Bars still had wine stains on their counters. Bathhouses still showed the marks of daily use. Snack shops, election posters, even preserved pet dogs curled protectively around what were likely their owner's children. That's what makes this one hit different. Not the idealized version of Rome from marble statues and official histories, but the real, messy, human version. People who worried about rent, who scratched crude jokes into plaster, who loved and argued and ate breakfast on an ordinary morning that just happened to be their last. March 1974. Central China, near the city of Xi'an. A group of farmers is digging a well during a drought, desperate to reach groundwater before their crops fail entirely. Instead of water, their shovels strike something hard and unexpected. Fragments of pottery. As they dig further, pieces of what look like a broken statue start turning up. A head, a torso, hands. At first, nobody thinks much of it. Broken pottery isn't exactly rare in this part of China. But local officials eventually get word, and archaeologists come out to take a proper look. What they find over the following months is almost impossible to process at first. Not one statue, not a dozen, thousands. An entire buried army, life-sized, arranged in precise military formation, stretching across pits covering an area larger than several football fields. Infantry, archers, cavalry complete with horses, chariots, generals standing slightly taller than the rest, marked by rank. Here's the detail that still gives archaeologists chills, and it genuinely gets me too. No two faces are exactly alike. Each soldier has individualized features, different hairstyles, different expressions, which suggests they may have been modeled, at least in part, on real people. Originally, they were painted in vivid color, though most of that pigment has faded or flaked away after centuries of exposure to air. This entire army was built to guard the tomb of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor to unify China, who started building his mausoleum the moment he took the throne, decades before he actually died. He wanted an empire to protect him in the afterlife exactly the way one had protected him in life. Now stay with me, because this is where the story gets genuinely strange. The emperor's actual burial chamber, believed to sit at the center of this vast complex, has never been opened. Ancient historical records describe rivers of mercury flowing across a miniature map of the empire inside the tomb, built to represent the rivers of China, with mechanisms designed to keep them flowing endlessly. For a long time, that sounded like exaggeration, maybe even myth. Then, modern soil testing around the tomb mound turned up unusually high concentrations of mercury in the ground, roughly matching the geography of ancient China. Archaeologists have deliberately chosen not to open the tomb itself, partly out of respect, partly because current preservation technology isn't advanced enough to guarantee whatever's inside survives contact with modern air. So it waits. Whatever the first emperor built for himself, sealed away over 2,000 years ago, is still down there, untouched, exactly as he left it. That's the part I find almost unsettling. We've mapped it, tested the soil around it, even measured the mercury, and we're still choosing not to look. In a world where we've photographed the surface of Mars, there's a room in China we've decided to leave alone. 1799, Napoleon's army is occupying Egypt, and French soldiers are reinforcing an old fort near the town of Rosetta in the Nile Delta. While digging into the fort's crumbling foundations, one of the soldiers, a man named Pierre-Francois Bouchard, notices something odd. A large slab of black granite wedged into the wall, clearly older than the fort itself and covered in strange inscriptions. At first, it doesn't seem all that remarkable. Ancient carved stones weren't exactly rare in Egypt. But someone looks closer and notices something unusual. There isn't just one script carved into the stone. There are three stacked on top of each other. At the top, hieroglyphics, the elaborate symbols of ancient Egypt that nobody in Europe had been able to read for well over 1,000 years. In the middle, Demotic, a simplified everyday Egyptian script. And at the bottom, ancient Greek, a language scholars could already read fluently. And this is where it clicks for everyone involved. If all three sections say the same thing, and scholars can already read the Greek, they might finally have the key to unlocking hieroglyphics, one of the greatest unsolved puzzles in history. The stone eventually ends up in British hands after Napoleon's forces are defeated in Egypt, and it gets shipped to London, where it still sits in the British Museum today. But the real breakthrough comes from a brilliant, obsessive French scholar named Jean-François Champollion. Champollion spends over a decade completely consumed by this problem. Other scholars had assumed hieroglyphics were purely symbolic, each image representing an idea rather than a sound. Champollion suspected something different, that the symbols also worked phonetically, representing actual sounds, much like an alphabet. Using the name Ptolemy, which appeared in the Greek text and was enclosed in an oval cartouche in the hieroglyphic section, he starts matching individual symbols to specific sounds. In 1822, it finally clicks into place. Champollion cracks the code. I still can't imagine what that moment must have felt like for him. 10 years of obsession, and then, all at once, 3,000 years of silence breaking open. Because this wasn't just an academic curiosity, it was a civilization getting its voice back after nearly 2,000 years. Suddenly, scholars could read temple walls, tomb inscriptions, royal decrees, everyday records directly in the words the ancient Egyptians actually chose to leave behind. An entire empire's worth of history, previously locked behind an unreadable script, opened all at once. 1900. A group of Greek sponge divers is caught in a storm near the small island of Antikythera, forced to shelter and wait it out before continuing their work. Once conditions clear, they go back to diving, searching the seabed for sponges the way they always have. Instead, one of them stumbles onto something else entirely, a shipwreck sitting on the ocean floor, undisturbed for roughly 2,000 years. At first, what they bring up seems like exactly what you'd expect. Broken statues, bronze figures, pottery shards, the usual remnants of Roman-era cargo. Interesting, valuable even, but not unprecedented. Then, among the wreckage, someone notices a strange lump of corroded green metal, barely recognizable, encrusted with marine growth. It gets set aside, unremarkable at first glance, tucked in with the rest of the recovered material and basically ignored for months. Now imagine you're the one who finally cracks that lump open. You're expecting scrap metal, maybe a corroded fitting off the ship. Instead, you find gears. I'd probably assume someone was playing a prank on me. But no, dozens of them, impossibly precise, interlocking in complex arrangements, clearly manufactured, not natural. For decades, nobody can fully explain what they're looking at. The complexity simply doesn't match anything historians associate with the ancient world. Gear technology this refined wasn't supposed to exist again until medieval European clockmaking, more than 1,000 years later. It isn't until the 2000s, when researchers use X-ray imaging and high-resolution CT scans, that the full picture finally comes into focus. And what they find is honestly kind of absurd for something 2,000 years old. At least 30 separate bronze gears working together as an astronomical calculator, tracking the sun and moon, predicting eclipses years in advance, even accounting for the moon's irregular orbit using a genuinely clever differential gear mechanism, one of the earliest known uses of that concept anywhere in history. This is where I had to stop and reread the source twice. It could even track the 4-year cycle of the ancient Olympic Games. This is one of my favorite discoveries on the whole list because it forces you to completely reconsider what ancient actually means. This wasn't a myth or some abstract philosophical idea about the cosmos. It was a working machine, built by people who understood gear ratios, astronomical cycles, and mechanical engineering with a level of precision that wouldn't be matched again for well over a millennium. Nobody knows exactly who built it, though a lot of researchers suspect it came out of a Greek scientific tradition connected to Archimedes' school of mechanical innovation. Whoever it was, they built something so far ahead of its time that when we finally understood it, it didn't just answer questions, it raised a much bigger one. What else did the ancient world figure out that we simply never found? September 1940. Southwestern France, in the middle of a war tearing the continent apart. 4 teenage boys are exploring the woods near the village of Montignac when their dog, reportedly named Robot, disappears down a hole in the ground. Trying to rescue him, they widen the opening and climb down into the darkness, using little more than a makeshift oil lamp to see. What their light reveals stops them cold. Covering the walls and ceiling of the cave are paintings, not crude scratches, genuinely stunning artwork. Massive bulls, some stretching over 16 feet long, horses in motion, caught mid-stride, deer, bison, strange abstract symbols scattered between them, all rendered with a confidence and sense of movement that feels startlingly modern. At first, it doesn't seem possible that anything this sophisticated could be ancient. Some early experts genuinely suspected a hoax, an elaborate prank. But careful examination and later radiocarbon dating of nearby materials confirms the paintings are roughly 17,000 years old, created by hunter-gatherers during the last ice age. And here's the part that still amazes researchers today. The artists who made these paintings had no metal tools, no artificial light beyond flickering animal fat lamps, and no formal training in any sense we'd recognize. And yet they used the natural contours of the cave walls to create a sense of depth and motion, mixed mineral pigments with remarkable consistency, and in some cases even appear to have used early animation-like techniques, overlapping limbs slightly to suggest movement when viewed by flickering torchlight. Think about what that means. Before Lascaux and a handful of similar caves found elsewhere in Europe, prehistoric people were often imagined as almost entirely primitive, focused purely on survival, with little room for anything resembling art or symbolic thought. Lascaux made that impossible to believe. These weren't simple survivalists scratching out crude marks. They were deliberate artists, working with intention, skill, and likely deep spiritual or ceremonial meaning behind every painted figure. The cave was eventually opened to the public, and within just a few years, the breath and body heat of thousands of visitors started damaging the delicate pigments and encouraging mold and algae to grow on the walls. It closed for good in 1963, and today an exact replica sits nearby so visitors can experience it without destroying the original. The real cave, the actual 17,000-year-old masterpiece, is once again sealed in darkness, protected the same way it survived for so many thousands of years before 4 boys and a curious dog stumbled onto it. What I love about Lascaux is that it's not evidence of survival, it's evidence of joy. Somebody stood in the dark with a stone lamp and decided a bull deserved to be beautiful. Nobody made them do that. By 1922, the British archaeologist Howard Carter has spent years searching Egypt's Valley of the Kings for a tomb almost everyone else believes doesn't exist or has already been found and stripped bare centuries ago. Season after season, he comes up empty. His wealthy backer, Lord Carnarvon, is losing patience and losing money. Carter gets one final season to prove himself. If he finds nothing this time, the funding ends completely. Picture that pressure for a second. Years of digging, nothing to show for it, and everyone around you quietly convinced you're chasing a tomb that isn't there. Then, in November, his team's water boy stumbles on a step carved into the rock, buried beneath centuries of debris from other excavations. Honestly, that could easily have been nothing. Countless steps and false leads had already led nowhere, but this one keeps going, step after step, cut down into the bedrock, leading to a sealed doorway. Carter sends an urgent telegram to Carnarvon, who rushes to Egypt from England. Together, on November 26, 1922, they stand in front of a second sealed door deeper inside the passage. Carter makes a small hole in the corner, just large enough to hold a candle up to, and peers through into the darkness beyond. Carnarvon, waiting anxiously behind him, asks if he can see anything. Carter's now famous reply, "Yes, wonderful things." Inside is the most complete, least disturbed royal tomb ever found in Egypt. Golden shrines nested one inside another, a solid gold death mask inlaid with lapis lazuli and colored glass that would go on to become one of the most recognizable objects in human history. Chariots, weapons, jewelry, furniture, statues, thousands of individual objects meticulously cataloged over the following decade, because Tutankhamun's tomb was found almost entirely intact, missed by grave robbers who had stripped nearly every other pharaoh's tomb bare over the preceding 3,000 years. And here's what makes this even stranger. Tutankhamun himself was, historically speaking, a minor king. He took the throne as a child, ruled for less than a decade, and died young, likely in his late teens, from causes still debated by researchers today, ranging from infection to genetic complications to an accident. He wasn't a particularly powerful or influential pharaoh in his own lifetime, and yet, because his tomb survived untouched while the tombs of far more significant rulers were plundered and lost to history, he became the most famous pharaoh in the world. There's something almost unfair about that if you think about it. Shortly after the discovery, Lord Carnarvon died from an infected mosquito bite, and newspapers, hungry for a sensational angle, ran wild with stories of an ancient curse protecting the tomb. Great headlines. Doesn't hold up under scrutiny, though. Most members of Carter's excavation team lived long, ordinary lives well into old age. Historians agree the curse was a media invention, but it stuck around in popular imagination for over a century regardless. What actually matters about this discovery isn't a curse, it's the sheer completeness of it. A perfectly preserved snapshot of royal Egyptian burial practice, wealth, and craftsmanship, sealed away for over 3,000 years. I think about Carter a lot. Years of failure, one last shot, and then the single most famous sentence in the history of archaeology. If he'd given up one season earlier, we'd have never known any of this was down there. Southeastern Turkey. For decades, there's a low, unremarkable hill near the town of Şanlı Ufa that local farmers have always found mildly annoying. Their plows keep striking large stone slabs buried just beneath the surface, forcing them to work around them. In the 1960s, American and Turkish researchers survey the site briefly, note some broken limestone slabs, assume they're related to a medieval cemetery, and move on to other, more promising locations. That assumption turns out to be one of the biggest missed calls in the history of archaeology. In the mid-1990s, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt takes another look at the site, and something about it doesn't sit right with him. The slabs feel older, much older, so he decides to dig properly. What his team uncovers over the following years quietly rewrites the entire timeline of human civilization. Buried beneath that unassuming hill are massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some standing over 16 feet tall and weighing many tons, arranged in large circular enclosures. Many are carved with intricate images of animals, foxes, boars, snakes, scorpions, vultures, rendered with genuine artistic skill. Then the dating results come back, and honestly, nobody's ready for what they show. The site is roughly 11,500 years old, older than Stonehenge by around 6,000 years, older than the pyramids of Giza by roughly 7,000 years, built before pottery, before metal tools, before agriculture itself, and this is exactly why it completely upends the traditional story of civilization. For generations, historians assumed the sequence went roughly like this. Humans settled down, developed farming to secure a stable food supply, formed permanent villages, and only once that foundation was firmly in place did they eventually build large monuments, temples, organized religion. Göbekli Tepe suggests the order might actually be reversed, or at the very least, far messier than that clean narrative allows. This monument appears to have been built by hunter-gatherers, people who hadn't yet developed farming or settled village life in any conventional sense, and yet they organized themselves well enough to quarry, transport, and erect multi-ton stone pillars, then carve them with real skill. Stop and think about what that actually takes. Serious cooperation, coordinated labor, shared belief. Some researchers argue it took a shared religious or ceremonial purpose to pull people together, long before farming ever gave them a practical reason to settle down and stay in one place. In other words, it's possible belief came first and agriculture came later, partly as a way to feed and sustain the growing numbers of people gathering at sacred sites just like this one. And here's the detail that blows my mind every single time I think about it. Archaeologists estimate that less than 10% of Göbekli Tepe has actually been excavated so far. Ground-penetrating radar surveys suggest there are more enclosures still buried beneath the hill, waiting. This is why I put it at number one. It suggests human beings weren't purely practical creatures, slowly grinding toward agriculture out of necessity alone. Long before we learned to plant crops in organized rows, we were already gathering in large numbers, carving meaning into stone, and building something bigger than any single person could build alone. I think that's what actually fascinates me most about Göbekli Tepe. It reminds us that people 11,000 years ago weren't just trying to survive, they were trying to create meaning, and I don't think we've changed all that much. Civilization, it turns out, may not have started with a plow. It may have started with a shared reason to believe in something. 10 discoveries. 10 completely different corners of the ancient world. A frozen body in the Alps. A ship buried in an English field. A goat that wandered into the wrong cave. A city sealed under ash. An army built for the afterlife. A stone that gave a civilization its voice back. A machine pulled from a shipwreck that shouldn't have existed for another 1,000 years. Paintings hidden in the dark for 17,000 years. A golden tomb behind a stairway nobody expected to find. And a hill that quietly rewrote the entire timeline of human civilization. Notice something they all have in common. None of them started with a team of experts setting out to make history. Every one of these discoveries started the same small, almost boring way. Someone noticed something, a shape in the ice, a line of rusted rivets in the soil, a shattering sound where there shouldn't have been one, a lump of corroded metal nobody bothered to look at closely for months. Someone noticed something that everyone else had walked straight past. That's the part that stays with me. History isn't only made by the people who set out looking for it. Sometimes it's made by a shepherd, a farmer, a group of teenagers with a curious dog, or divers just trying to wait out a storm. And if that's true, then history isn't finished. It never really was. Somewhere right now, under a field, beneath a hillside, at the bottom of an ocean nobody's mapped closely enough yet, the next discovery is already sitting there, waiting for someone ordinary to notice it. If you enjoyed uncovering these forgotten stories, subscribe to Dead Empires for more journeys into the past. Until next time, remember, empires die, their secrets don't.